Is dance about transferring a narrative to the audience, or is it about encouraging an audience to transfer their narrative onto the stage? I'll give you an example. You look at a tree, and the tree can be romantic or pastoral or peaceful or scary or whatever else happens to trigger that response in the observer. The tree itself is a tree, it doesn't care. So why does that happen? I think to a certain extent, the crazy complexity of the bark, the limbs, the branches, the leaves, the interrelationship to the wind, the interrelationship to the sunlight or lack of light, all these elements create a vastly complicated visual entity. And when we're facing something that is visually as complex as our own internal psychology, because we're complex creatures, then we tend to transfer that onto something outside of ourselves, perhaps to better understand, perhaps for some other reason. And so can it be argued that choreography is there to create a second complex virtual body that is not related to the physical body, but is created through the movement? And does that complexity then encourage the audience to transfer their specific points of views, memories, associations, desires, and so on, onto the performer, rather than the performer transferring it onto them? There was the first time that I used arm and hand gestures, and I remember giving it to Jeanette as a sort of, discovery. What happens if you create precision, not just in terms of the holistic body shape or the legs, but also what happens when you actually give this kind of direction and definition to arms and hands? Because I felt in some ways that was a logical bridge to an audience. Because audiences, people in general, will use, as I'm doing right now, hands and arms to frame essentially an argument, or to frame whatever you happen to be saying. So we're used to using that part of the body for aesthetic reasons. It's not just functional. And so that was interesting how by adding a lot of layers of movement and increasing the speed of them, you created a sort of halo around the dancer that was composed of precise movements, but in some ways was also a flux around the upper body. And to a certain extent, I think a dancer that is performing the piece very well, you tend to want to look at their face. Even though, they're doing very complicated things with their arms and legs and so on and so forth, you're always attracted back to wanting to know something about that person, and the face is a logical point of view. If they're effective as a performer, that generally happens. There's something else that's interesting about the idea of film, and that is the rectangle. And it's the same rectangle as you'll find on stage. I mean, you can present like we did in Lily Marlene, outside of the rectangle. We can reverse that, it's possible, it's interesting. But what is that rectangle? What does it signify? It signifies social structure. It holds within its structure craziness, whatever point of view you happen to want to express as an artist, but within a controlled frame. And so we tend to look at film within that frame. It's sort of, in a way, comforting to see the frame and then be able to delve into whatever is being expressed. And that's fundamental to theater as well. The stage is a bit like that. And what role does that play? Well, it permits the audience to experience extreme behavior, potentially, in a societal kind of environment where nothing bad is going to happen. So it's essentially an approved social method of introducing more personal, more evocative behavior, because an audience wants to go see a performance, whether it's theater or dance, whatever, to be exposed to the elements that are not necessarily the ones they're exposed to in normal society.
A heightened reality.
Yeah, and that's part of the experience. It's a fundamental, it's a viscerally human thing, because basically you're looking at one fundamental thing that theater, and I mean generically theater, not just dance or theater, whatever. And that is two groups of strangers, one on stage, one in the audience. They haven't met. They have no intention to meet in the future. They have no intention to develop any kind of relationship, yet they're going to be exposing each other to extreme behavior that normally comes about only when a relationship has matured past a certain point. So here we are with two strangers experiencing extreme human behaviors that are normally very personal, and then leaving without ever meeting or ever continuing that at all. That's fundamental to human expression, because it's not enhanced, it's not artificial. It really is the meeting of two. It's almost tribal, and in some ways it links people together in ways that are not intellectual, they're not rational, but they've experienced an emotion and an empathy towards a different point of view, towards a point of view that isn't theirs and that they did not necessarily have when they entered the theater. And that's a fundamental corridor of communication that's I think, vastly underrated and more and more necessary, given that we are, at some point, yes, in communication with each other, but not in the same room when we're doing it. And that changes a lot of things.
Notes and intimacy in their TV screen, on stage, on film.
Yeah. I think social intimacy is real. There are intimacies that we share with people or with smaller groups, but there's also a certain social intimacy that we can share, and it's important that the various points of views of society be presented in a relatively proximate manner, not through the media, not through media, but also directly in an exchange, the way the theater environment permits it.
And then I'm going to shift a bit more into, film again is something that you've always used on some level in your work, but when you did Amelia, which was spectacular and so stunning, and your use again of the camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea was to move the camera in a choreographed way.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it did, the way it followed the movement.
Because there was not one overriding angle. Like you can do a 10-second section, but you've also got another camera filming everything in case that doesn't work. We didn't have that. In other words, if any of the shots had not worked, there was no way to bridge to the next one. So it really was.
So did you just storyboard that?
Yeah. And what wasn't on storyboard was up here, and the connection needed to happen because there was no, and it was important because Otherwise, the point of view that you mentioned about the camera moving would have disappeared. Because the whole point was to have a moving camera to correspond to the movement it was filming. But with one witness camera that wasn't moving, that would have gone, you know, and also it would have created pressure to, well, okay, we've done enough of that, let's move on. We have a safety. You know, safeties are not safe. So you eventually end up with a generic kind of film as opposed to something that had personality or point of view. Editing dance is really difficult because let's take an orchestra as an example. You know, we've all seen orchestras being, you know, filmed. Well, let's say you go close up for the violin player. You still hear the rest of the orchestra. You know, when we're filming dance, it's the equivalent of going into a violin player and not hearing anything else for the moment when you're on the violin player. Because essentially what we do is expressed through our bodies. And if you decide to go on a close-up of my face at a moment when I'm doing something, then that thing will be lost. So it's a much more editing dependent experience. Not constantly, but we were touring for 2 calendar years. Yeah.
And so you're taking this around the world, and how is the response? Was the response?
It was strangely universal. No, it was strangely universal. I would have expected certain cultures to respond differently, but they were pretty similar. Like in the dark of the theater, you couldn't tell whether you were in Italy or Spain or Germany or. There were certain characteristics. I remember there was a theater called BMV, which was subsidized by the car company, and I remember it was during the Human Sex Day. So you know, this thing of, my God, it's so extreme. You need to. And the director said, you know, the vice president of BMV is coming. You know, and it's a bit extreme, your thing. So I'm going to give them a warning. And I said, okay, fine. And so we did our performance, and then he came backstage. And he went, oh, this is very interesting. I'm going to come back with my wife and 2 children on Sunday. And the sense of, oh my God, this is so extreme, didn't resonate as being quite as extreme in Germanic culture. And the French responded differently. They were always looking for the idea behind the concept. So, I mean, there were differences in culture, but overall, the response generally tended to be universal.
Yeah, but the movement was actually quite aggressive. Like it.
I don't think it's aggressive. I think there's a difference between aggressive and speed. You know, I mean, or aggressive and volume. You know, I mean, you can speak loudly. That doesn't mean you're being aggressive about what you're saying. And if you're going quickly, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're being aggressive in that. I think those are levels of volume. And in certain situations where you're used to one type of volume, then to change that volume is, you know, initiates a response. But the intent was never aggressive. I'm not interested in that, and nobody in that company was. But I think, yeah, so I think that was sort of judged along the conventions of what was expected, and that created that aspect to it, but we were never interested in that.
Wasn't intentional. I think when especially human sex kind of took the world over. And,
human sex took the world over, that's...
Well, maybe you didn't, you weren't the person who
Human sex has taken the world over many times.
Your presentation of gender, Louise was equally as strong as any of
Yeah.
them, you know, and I had always associated it just with Louise, but when I saw bits from Infante, Se Destroy,
The classical bits, or?
well, just all of the female dancers
Yeah.
had that same unbelievable
Yeah.
power.
It ported over to when we did ballet too. Like when
Yeah.
we switched over to ballet, we didn't want to get all of a sudden to this fragile kind of relationship between. But you know, it's all built on illusion. Right? The idea of a pas de deux, like a man lifting a woman, is considered normal. A woman lifting a man is not considered normal. Perhaps it is today. It wasn't then. And in fact, in many of the places, not many, but some places where the gender roles were particularly well defined, I won't name the countries, they would assume that Louise was in fact a man who, you know, had a wig and all the rest of it. But essentially, they're both impossible. A man will not be able to lift a woman who does not want to be lifted, and a woman will not be able to lift a man who does not want to be lifted. So essentially, you're looking at symbols that happen because of the cooperation between people. So in fact, while many people assumed that this was kind of a extreme, almost you know, aggressive stance between people on stage, it was actually extremely cooperative because everything depended on the cooperation of the other.
You make decisions with live performances, with lighting, with staging.
When we were touring in England as a company, we met the gentleman who was the founder of Clark Shoes, because he loved dance. And he brought us to some of the things that he liked about Bath, which is where we met him. And one of the places that he enjoyed was the Gothic Cathedral. And he, given who he was able to bring us to the roof of the cathedral. And what was striking to me was the amount of detailing in the roof in places no one would ever see it. And that again was interesting because that implied that it was interesting to imagine choreography not simply as something that would be of use to the observer, but also would keep within itself certain hidden traits that was specific to it, but not necessarily observable. And so this idea of creating structures that for X or Y reason, maybe because, you know, somebody was in front of the person doing it, or because maybe they were going a little bit too fast to be fully understood, or because they were in relative darkness or whatever, still existed. And this sense of creating something that was not of use all the time was interesting.
Yeah.
Rudy van Danse, who was the artistic director of the Dutch National Ballet at the time, came to one of our performances and invited me to do a piece for the Dutch National. And I said, why do you want me to do a piece for the Dutch National? He said, because ballet's everywhere in human sex. It's everywhere. And I went, really? Okay. And I guess he was right, because there were the arabesques, there were the entrechats, there were those various elements, but in a place where they were not overly stated or underlined with lights, and where the music was, because, you know, people will, to a certain point, see through music. Music is a very warm medium. It will affect your emotions, whereas Sight will not. Sight is a cold, it's a cold sense. It doesn't, I mean, anybody can see that if they look at a film, for instance, and close off the music. Right away, if it's, you know, a romantic or a horror movie or whatever, it disappears. That layer disappears and it becomes oddly cold. And to a certain extent, I've always said that dance never depended on music because it's two different art forms. You don't go to a composer and say, I can possibly be composing music without the presence of the dancer. How do you do that? But the reverse is often asked. How can you be composing choreography without the presence of music? Well, it's an argument that is not symmetrical. If it's very possible for a composer to compose without a dancer, why is it so impossible to compose dance without music? And in fact, the two are not related. They are, one is emotion-inducing, which is what music does. I remember having a conversation with David Lang and him telling me that he could make a lottery winner feel terrible by using 4 specific notes, and he wouldn't even have a reason for it. So yeah, there's an important emotional transference, and you know, you can, to a certain point, coast on it choreographically if you wish to. So in some ways you can, you know, put your fingers in your ears and judge the validity of a choreography based on what impact it has once the music goes. So there was 2 different elements that were being brought together, and they were not complementary. The music was not highlighting the textures and the structures in the dance. It was fighting them.
Yes.
And so people would, to a certain extent, respond in part to the music as well, and sort of highlight the extreme movements because the music was extreme, but not necessarily notice all the other movements that preceded or followed those extreme movements, and Rudy Van Danzig did.
Big awards, Geminis, Governor Generals, Order of Canada.
If you don't enjoy working in the studio, there's no amount of honor or audience reaction that's ever going to justify anything else, because they're in the great minority. You know, you spend 90% of your career in the studio and 10% presenting the results.
Is that your sense that you enjoy more, being in the studio, the process?
Well, I was going to say that if you don't enjoy the studio, that's 90% of your career.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's nothing that could potentially happen in those 10% that's going to overweigh what happens in the studio. Yes, I do, because it's magical. It's a moment. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on. It's a great reality show. I mean, honestly, if the concept existed earlier on in the company's history, it would have been a great TV reality, because you literally see the change. You know, not a little bit, you see it a lot. You see the tentative arrival of the person. It's that person's first reaction to propositions of movement, the structure as it takes shape, as parts are eliminated, and that person's meandering, you know. It's sort of like, you see a plant grow towards the sun, it doesn't go like this, it goes like this. It goes like, and it's the same thing. And it's fascinating. It's like this bunch of relationships going through all these various cycles, and then you see it evolve gradually to the stage. And I can guarantee you there's nothing at the beginning that would have told you how it would have ended on stage. It's really a process. And I've never gotten used to it. I've seen it happen so many times. There were so many productions, so many years, sometimes with my company, sometimes with others, sometimes with non-dancers, whatever. It's always the same thing. This sense of not knowing where it's going to go. And that's so fundamental to our lives, right? I mean, it's like we don't know where we're going to go. We don't know where we're going to end up. So there's something really, you know, magical about studio work.
Are you filming? Pam, pam. Tendu. Développer, tendu, développer. Échapper. Double. Fifth.
an age where we are looking back at them. We are wondering, talking about remounts, reimaginings, in a way that ballet's been doing forever, but contemporary not so much. And is it something that you think you want to go on after you?
Again, we got to look at our source. When we first started, archival was less important than survival. So, archival meant putting attention on things that were not immediately useful. We didn't need to archive in order to continue functioning in terms of what we were presenting. So that was not a priority. And so that becomes a habit. It's not done the first year, it's not done the second, and we'll just touch a little bit on the fourth. And eventually, you don't touch on it because you say, well, look, we've already not done this many of them, so what's the point? We're not going to get the archive anyway. And there was something freeing about it because you didn't belong to your past. There was, if you look at the decisions that will direct a career, in part it is traction, and in part it's rejection. Sometimes you reject what you decide was interesting the time before. You no longer want to do that. And so this mix of rejection and attraction creates a very meandering kind of approach. And it's harder to do when you archive because you literally have to define everything. And as soon as it becomes an intellectual construct, that emotional kind of reaction to it dissipates. At the same time, yeah, there are times when I would say, I remember this happening and I wish I could see it. I wish I could see that performance again because so-and-so did it so beautifully, or that environment was so. And so, yeah, there's a regret about that doing too. But, if you look at dance in general, it has no knowledge of its history. It doesn't. Even if you look at, the ballets, Swan Lakes and so on, you don't have any guarantee that was the steps that was used originally. It's sort of like telephone. It's sort of like, okay, they sort of did this, yeah, well, they'll pass it on that way, and they'll pass it on that way. And it's equivalent in literature of getting a description of Shakespeare. Well, he sort of wrote a play that was about like this, and he sort of said something like that. But, the exactitude of it is not part of dance history, given that it's a very complex art form that needs very complex archival techniques to properly record. And anyway, how do you record this? How do you do that? Okay, so you have video. Okay, fine. Okay, we have video, that's fine. All you have to do is point the camera and we're okay. Yeah, except A, it's going, super fast, let's say. B, you don't know what's happening on this side or on that side or on that side. And sometimes you need that information to be able to understand. And sometimes the coloration of the dancer has made it so that it's literally hard to sort of figure out what the roots of the movement was because they've so personalized it. So that's not enough. So eventually you're looking at considerable amounts of expense to properly record something to the point where it can be transferred objectively and completely from generation to generation. And dance isn't moneyed. It's not a.
It's also.
It's not a.
It's quite an elusive art form. It's especially contemporary. I mean, ballet. It's a different audiences who go to ballet and go to Swan Lake again and again over the years with different companies.
And they do.
They they sort of have the opportunity to grow and see a piece in many different lights, where contemporary, not so much you, Mr. I tour around the world for 2 years, but many pieces, were on stage for 2 nights.
I didn't tour everything for 2 years. I worked with other companies.
Well,
they didn't tour at all. They just stayed in the same city I created the stuff for.
A lot of pieces were, very much like there today, here today, gone tomorrow, never to be seen again. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what dance is. Maybe it's really an art form that you
it's
have to be there
ephemeral,
for.
yeah. I mean, it's ephemeral by
Yeah.
its nature. It's very complex, I mean, it's the notational aspect of putting movement on paper is it's not easy. And I don't know if I'm wrong, you know, and maybe the viewers will figure it out, but I remember hearing musical notation has 4 parameters and human body is 127. I don't know, maybe that's complete bullshit. I don't know, it just stays in my mind all the time. But for sure, any kind of complexity in, you know, the extremities is a very hard thing to properly record.
Do you have interest personally in your work living on beyond you?
You know, does that extend to everything else? I mean, do I have an interest in? I don't know. It's a metaphysical question you're asking. But just to go back a slight bit, when you talk about the classical ballet, you know, having more of a the difference, classical ballet, repeating these same choreographies over and over again with slight little variations from company to company, is that the dancer is the center of focus, not the choreographer. I mean, basically it's how they dance what is already known. So and so will dance it this way. So, and I think that's kind of nice. I mean, I wish contemporary ballet or dance would encourage the appreciation given to the performance, not just to the choreography. I think it's lacking a little bit in that because, you know, the act of dancing is an act of intelligence, and it's interesting to be able to respond to that specifically without necessarily talking about the person that created the structure. So, you know, there's something we learned there. Do I feel that I don't know. I don't know what I'll feel. I suspect on the day of my death I won't be thinking about that very much.
Where's my work going?
Yeah, it's like, oh my God, did I archive this?
Oh no.
I don't know. I don't think so.
But your brain, you're still a very creative human being. You have a very creative brain. You continue to forge ahead.
Yeah, no, I've never considered creation to be creation. You got to be careful about that word, because that implies that you're creating something out of nothing. We filter things. We're good filterers. We are able to see something and in some way modify that thing to something else. I think if you'd never seen the color red, there's nothing I could possibly find in language that would make you understand that. You know, I mean, language is essentially reference to memories. Red only means something if you've actually seen the color. And then you can modify the color, darker red, okay, dark, I've seen dark, red, I've seen red, okay, so it's a dark. So this kind of reference to memory is part of language, but the synthesis from nothing to arrive at a commonly agreed upon result, meaning I'm going to describe to you what red is, and at the end of that description, you're going to see the same kind of red I am. When you've never seen it before, forget it. So the idea of a creation thing is delicate. If you see it more as a filtering thing, then you don't run out, because that whatever's coming at you keeps coming at you, and what you're doing is you're altering one structure to reach towards another, and you're also listening, because society whispers all the time, tells you things. And it's difficult to hear sometimes, but when you're in a situation where you're going to when you're going to organize, then
Gotcha.
you're more susceptible to listening to them. And you know, I mean, the fundamental thing is there's never an answer, it's always a search. And the search is the exciting part. It never should be attached to the pretension of finding the answer. There is no such thing. But the search itself is us recreating the nomadic experience, where, you know, we would go from place to place, where now we don't go from place to place. We go from idea to idea. And it's a bit like traveling through unknown territory. It's got the same advantages and the same dangers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.